Hello, and welcome to the Joy of Drafting. This is Travis Semulin Sowers, and today we're going to talk about building a mana base. After you've drafted your deck, you'll need to make sure that you have the right colors of mana and the right amount of mana to cast your spells. Most limited decks run 17 lands. There are times when you'll want more, and other times you'll want fewer. How do you tell how many lands you want? Should you be running 10 mountains and 7 swamps? Let's dive in. We're going to start with the basics. How many lands should you play? 17 is a good place to start in your 40-card limited deck. A good key to identifying when you would want more or fewer lands is something called a mana sink. Let's look at a few examples of a mana sink. General's Enforcer. White-black for a 2/3. You can spend 2 white-black, exile a card from a graveyard, and make a 1/1 creature token. Wildheart Invoker. 2 green for a 4/3. You can spend 8 mana to give a creature +5/+5 and trample until end of turn. These 2 creatures have good stats for their mana cost. You'd happily play a 2 mana 2/3 and a 4 mana 4/3 in most limited decks. They also allow you to spend mana and get an effect, either producing more creatures or making the ones you have bigger for a turn. Those aren't effects we'd want on their own, for example an 8 mana combat trick, but when attached to reasonable creatures, these effects are quite good. Why? Have you ever lost a game of Magic because you didn't draw enough lands? Sure, it happens to all of us. The land, or mana system, is what produces variance in the game of Magic. If you don't have enough lands in your deck, you may find yourself stuck on 2 lands with expensive cards in hand, but you can plan for those times when you draw too many lands, or flood out, as many Magic players call it. A deck that has 2 or 3 good mana sinks can happily play 18 lands, and not be too sad about drawing additional lands. This means you'll rarely have too few lands, and when you do have too many, you'll have something to do with the extra mana. Looter cards like Teferi's Protege, 2 blue for a 2/3, you may spend 1 blue to tap, draw a card, and then discard a card, can also help fill this spot. These cards let you turn extra lands into more cards. They're often found in red and blue. If you're able to find multiple good mana sinks and a looter or 2, your deck may be a good candidate to run 18 or even 19 lands. Be careful not to mistake cards with flexible casting costs, like kickers for example, for a mana sink. To qualify as a mana sink, the effect must be repeatable. When should you run fewer lands? If your deck has a bunch of good 2-drops and your curve stops at 5 mana, you're likely a good candidate for a 16-land deck. It's also okay to run 16 lands with 1 6-drop, but I wouldn't advise running more than 1 6-drop or any higher casting cost cards in such a scenario. There are some other situations in which you can run fewer lands. For example, in the set Ikora, there are many 1-mana cycling cards. If you have enough of these, and you should, you've been drafting flexible cards, right? You can trim a few lands, with the idea that the cyclers will help you find lands if you need them, and would be a better top deck than a land in the late game. Top limited players suggest a 1-to-3 ratio, running 1 fewer land for every 3 1-mana cyclers you have. 1-mana cantrips also allow you to trim lands. A cantrip is a card that draws another card while having an effect. In the Core 21 set, there are 2 1-mana cantrips we're going to take a look at. Crash Through, red, creatures gain trample until end of turn, draw a card, and Opt, scry 1, then draw a card for blue. These cards aren't great on their own, but the blue-red deck often wants to draw cards and have a lot of spells in its graveyard. In this case, you could consider cutting a land for every 3 copies of these cards that you have. I don't often go below 15 lands, but in a deck with 6 1-mana cyclers or 1-mana cantrips, it could be a good call. I'd like to note one last card that has popped up in a few sets recently, and I've seen many limited players dismiss. To be fair, it's not an amazing card, but there are times when it's correct to play it in 16 lands. That card is Adventurous Impulse. Green, look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature or land from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. If your deck has at least 9 green sources, this is likely better than a 10th forest. Early game, you can just go find the land that you need, and late game, it's a much better top deck than a land. Be on the lookout for cards and synergies like these to cut a land or add in an extra one. Now that we've figured out how many lands to play, What colors should they be? Most players default to 9 of their main color and 8 of the secondary color, and this will work well in most cases. To build the best mana base though, lay out your cards in a mana curve as we talked about in episode 2. Look at when you want to cast them. Do you have a really good 2-drop that costs black? Are most of your red cards only asking for a single red mana? This is a situation where you're going to want more black than red in the deck, maybe even 10 swamps and 7 mountains. You want more of the color that's allowing you to cast your early game spells and creatures. By the time the late game rolls around, you'll have enough of the right colors to cast your late game cards. Dual lands show up in most sets these days, and when you see them, they're likely worth a pick. I wouldn't grab them over premium cards like bombs and removal, or even a really good value card, but when it's later in the pack and we're looking at a replaceable 2-drop or a card like Rugged Highlands, a land that enters the battlefield tapped, you gain 1 life, and can tap for red or green mana, I'd encourage you to grab the land. You're likely to find another 2-drop later. Think about this. If I don't pick any dual lands, I'm only going to play 23 of my draft picks with 17 basic lands. If you pick 2 dual lands, you're going to be playing 25 of your draft picks with only 15 basic lands, and you're less likely to have the wrong colors of mana. The cost of the land coming into play tapped is worth the consistency you gain by having the fixing, even if you're only playing 2 colors. How should you build a mana base to splash? What is splashing? Stay tuned for the next episode, and we'll cover that in detail. Thank you for watching this episode. Please like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any in the future. While you're at it, tell a friend about the series. We could use the views. If you'd like to see the theory in practice, stop by my Twitch stream at www.twitch.tv/Semulin. I'll see you next time on The Joy of Drafting, and until then, all your mana base are belong to us.